Okay, welcome back. Again, this is Mr. Clark, and this is part three of our China Political Institutions and Culture series of lectures. Today we're going to start with the mass line. So it was originally developed under Mao by the Standing Committee and the Politburo, and the method had everything to do with adapting a form of Lenin's vanguard socialism where there was a protectorate that kind of emboldened the the lower class, and this was done almost comically through a top-down approach where the leadership would come up with whatever the party thought was correct, and then would teach it in Shaozu or political educational meetings. Those party goals would be articulated. They would be used to mobilize support, and they became a source of self-criticism and accusation of groups. And this played a central part of during the Cultural Revolution, where peasants were upending their longtime landowners and kind of local businessmen that controlled the wealth and land in various areas. So during the Cultural Revolution, kind of this Leninism and vanguard method to teach socialism and kind of change what political culture was to adopt Maoist sentiments that he wanted to bring to the political culture, and kind of the injection of socialism into the political landscape was paramount, and kind of emboldening this idea of egalitarianism that was worked contrary to the established hierarchies that had existed during Imperial China. It was an important method for them to be able to do that. So it was funny because it was top down, but at the same time bottom up. Well, once Mao took a step back after many of his disastrous policies, and he came back, as we saw in the Great Leap Forward. One of the things that was used was Mao's Little Red Book, and I'm going to see if we can pull off watching a 3-minute YouTube clip about Mao's Little Red Book, because it also had a very important place in kind of the second iteration of the mass line. So after Mao's Little Red Book was kind of used for the basis of these political education meetings, or the Xiaozu, as kind of the central point of the mass line, it took on a whole new meaning as the Little Red Book as almost their kind of a pocket Bible that everyone had to take with them. Now, instead of the Xiaozu, the main thing, the primary way that the desire of the CCP and the government is communicated is through cadres who help lead the Danwai from the gatherings of place of employment. And that's one way that economic liberalism has changed the structure of how the mass line works in China. After Mao, under Deng Xiaoping, what he wanted to communicate via the mass line was the four modernizations, and this is something that you should know. It's what kind of transitions Xiaoping's kind of difference in perspective from Mao. And the four modernizations are industry, agriculture, science, and the military. But it was this kind of injection of some capitalism into the authoritarian state. So as opposed to communism meaning the equal distribution of wealth and working for the collective, people were actually given an individual economic incentive to produce capital. Under Jiang Zemin, what he communicated were the three represents, and this was announced in 2000. They were formally adopted in 2002, and they said that the CCP should always represent the development of China's advanced productive forces, which means kind of economic growth rules the day, and is the most kind of benevolent thing that they can go towards. And the onward direction of China's advanced culture, kind of this idea of nationalism replaces what the ideology was. So instead of communism being the utmost importance, nationalism and the pride of China. So it's still collective in that nature, but kind of a different means to going there. And when Beijing hosted the Olympics in 2008, that was very much on display in a lot of the presentations. They used large amounts of people in this kind of collectivized manner in celebration of their country. Also, one of the other things that come from the three represents are the fundamental interests of the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people. So this no longer was the proletariat, but instead these interests were that of entrepreneurs and business leaders. And now those people are welcome within the CCP. So the mass line still functions today. It's just teaching something very different than under Mao Zedong. That brings us to the parallels in hierarchies in China. And you can see I just kind of took a picture right from your book. So the political structures of the PRC, as you can see, are best characterized as three parallel hierarchies. And they maintain separate entities, but they work in combination with each other and in support of each other. So the party dominates the three organizations, but they still are separate. They have a relationship between the party and the government, and that is controlled by the vocabulary world dual rule, which means the vertical supervision of the next higher level of government and the horizontal supervision of the Communist Party at the same level. And if you're looking for what this structure of government looks like, it's actually most closely related to the USSR. And the reason is because originally the USSR helped China construct what this government looks like. Of course, the USSR has been disbanded and no longer looks like this, but this the CCP continues in this structure as of today that provides these dual roles for party members that both have lots of impact on the military and the government. But what's a little bit different between the USSR and China is that a lot of China's policymaking today is still more governed by personal relationships. And we'll continue to talk about that and kind of the factions that exist and the various interests that are interrelated within the party that can be widespread supported and kind of through that gift giving of personal relationships. The next thing is the Feng Shui, and you all should remember from your reading that the Feng Shui is a letting go and tightening up cycle. It was most evidenced under Mao, and it was in reaction to his 100 Flowers movement. So a cracking down and kind of a loosening up. So once things loosen up, if a challenge emerges, then you can crack back down. And it's important to maintain authoritarian legitimacy, that you're willing to crack down when necessary, and then to let up when those kind of movements against you dissipate a little bit. So the cycle consists of three types of different actions and policies. The first one is economic reform. The second one are the political movements, and that's where the letting go happens. And then the tightening up is obviously by the CCP. So when the new reforms reflect economic liberalization, liberal factions react with a demand for political liberalization. The idea that open markets should lead to open democracy. And then the party has to respond in force in order to squash the desire for political liberalization and transparency. So policymakers meeting behind closed doors is one of the ways that they can kind of control the message and make them not responsible to the people, and really try and create an apolitical citizen inside of the country. But here's the demonstration of this Feng Shui. As you can see in the thing, you had the four modernizations, which led to the political movement of the Democracy Wall movement, and then the delegalization of protest meant it was bound. Went back to the Second Revolution, which opened up the market more, student democracy, and you see that cycle repeating itself from 1978 until recent. Our next topic are elections. Now, elections are not going to be directly on your test, but it's important that we briefly talk about them. The only reason that elections are held are to legitimize the government and the CCP, but the party controls the commissions that run the elections and also reviews the draft lists of the proposed candidates. So only direct elections are held at a local level. So some deputies at the very local level get to serve on the county people's congresses. But since the 1980s, the CCP has allowed competitive elections for some county positions, and most candidates are nominated by the people. And there have been instances where some non-communists win. It just doesn't represent a sufficient challenge to the CCP for them to prevent that. One other big change was in 1987 were the election to village communities, and that meant that local officials are no longer appointed, but there are secret ballot elections for 3 terms. Essentially, the government effort to retain local control and support after decollectivization, but remains a major political gamble, as we've seen rises in protests, especially in the last 5 years in a lot of the rural areas. And kind of in the manner of Feng Shui, we did see in 1998 kind of a directive that says that the Communist Party should take the lead in those village governments. So even though there are some free elections, there's still kind of something a barrier that exists over the top of them that prevent them from going too far away from what the cadres representing the CCP would want. The next thing, again, are interest groups. So interest groups do exist, and this was something that was in your reading that you just had, but they're not allowed to influence the government unless they are created and supported by party and state authority. So that's one, and the way that that's done is through the various Danweis, the DANWEI. So how the Danwei units work is that they're organized to help the CCP control urban areas. So they're the effect of the mass line, and because what it does, it gives a sense of democracy because you're meeting with your Danwei group, but what's being communicated to you is the party's will. And so, yes, you're all getting on the same page in a political discussion that directly affects your type of employment, but those decisions have already been decided by the people that control the government. So in these, people depend on the Danwei and their things for income and insurance. So they are under threat to obey the policies that are created under these faux interest groups, or they could lose their jobs. Some economic liberalization has been a challenge to aspects of this because they're more of the employment is collectivized and more of it's controlled even by foreign CEOs, but none of them want to cross the CCP, and so any big challenge that could happen is either squashed or corrected by the CCP in a very timely fashion. There is one giant interest group, and it is the All China Federation of Trade Union, which is the insignia that you have on the PowerPoint slide in front of you. But it's a state-run union. Again, this is a definition of what state corporatism is when these organizations really are only created to support and do the will of the state. And so this large national trade union a union of all the various trades in China is something that is encompasses almost all of the professions, and that is where lobbying for workers' rights happens, but it's all at the will of the party for how serious that could be. And obviously, olive branches are extended to make people feel accomplished and included, which is one more way that the mass line works through Danwei. I do think that it's important to note, and I do think it was a question on your study guide, that farmers are not included in the All China Federation of Trade Union. And so they're actually one of the groups that's most likely to protest in the rural areas. All right, our last slide for today is the mass media. So it's tightly controlled by the CCP, especially the broadcast media. Something interesting, in 2002, Rupert Murdoch received permission to broadcast Phoenix, which was a Chinese language station, but in return agreed to government control over the news content. In 1978, fewer than 900 periodicals and 200 newspapers. In 2004, up to 8,000 were up to 8,000, but most new print media is non-political. So what you get is sports, fashion, music, movie stars, all kind of that opiate of the masses, as Karl Marx would say. The majority of Chinese say they never talk about politics, so the goal of creating an apolitical citizenry is something that has been succeeding. The poll shows that there's actually little support for outside polls for democratic values. The internet is the main alternative source of information. In access, especially in urban areas, is widespread, and one of the main parts of political dissent that's been harder for people to squash are the bloggers and web page hosts, and so they have now been required to register with the government prior to to creating their sites. Also, if you're a hacker, there's prison sentences for that, and they're a lot more aggressive. They have over 10,000 people that are responsible for making sure what's on the internet is regulated. Let's talk about the three different types of the three major media sources. The first one is the Xinhua, and I hope I'm saying that correctly. It's the official government press agency. It has thousands of employees and even has an international presence with different stations and outlets across the world. You also have shown here the People's Daily. That's the official newspaper of the CCP. And then you also have the CCTV, which is the one on your right. It's the major state television broadcaster. And what we see kind of from these various news sources that it's become increasingly commercialized. So there is more competition, diversity in content, and investigative reporting is happening, but it's still important because there's heavy censorship involved. And so the investigative authority will target corruption and things like that as long as it's lower level and doesn't challenge the CCP at large, unless the CCP wants it to, because they can use it as a cleansing mechanism. So there is money to be had, and so there is competition generated within different channels, different newspapers, and different news agencies, but a lot of that either has to be apolitical, or if it is political, it's at the will of the CCP, because it's better for business if you're at will of the CCP. That concludes the political structures and culture lecture for this, and thank you for watching and listening in my first attempt at these, and hopefully they'll continue to improve and be a good source of information as you study for the AP test. Hope you all are doing well at home, and I'll talk to you later.